to Dorian Gray. This is chapter 16. We last left Dorian Gray eyeing that lump of greenish paste, the opium, in his home, but then taking the cab far out of town to some dodgy area. We knew he was going to this opium den. And that's where we're going to pick up the story, and it's getting so interesting now I couldn't skip anything. So this is the whole of chapter 16. A cold rain began to fall, and the blurred street lamps looked ghastly in the dripping mist, adding to our Gothic novel creepy feeling. The public houses, the bars, were just closing, and dim men and women were clustering in broken groups round their doors. From some of the bars came the sound of horrible laughter. In others, drunkards brawled and screamed. Lying back in the hansom, the cab, with his hat pulled over his forehead, Dorian Gray watched with listless eyes the sordid shame of the great city. They're seeing all the nasty things that go on in the big city, but he's seeing them with listless or tired eyes. He's already had his fill of sin, the sordid shame of the great city. And now and then he repeated to himself the words that Lord Henry had said to him on the first day they had met: to cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. So, of course, he's taken Lord Henry's advice for all these years, and I think he's come out of it. Well, it's given him satisfactions, as the next line's going to say. Yes, that was the secret. He had often tried it, and would try it again now. There were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, buy nothingness. Dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. And of course that makes it clear this is not a solution. It just makes it worse. The moon hung low in the sky like a yellow skull. Of course that simile adding to the sense of creepiness and foreboding. From time to time, a huge misshapen cloud stretched a long arm across and hid the moon. The gas lamps grew fewer, and the streets more narrow and gloomy. Once the man lost his way, the driver, and had to drive back half a mile. A steam rose from the horse as it splashed up the puddles. The side windows of the hansom were clogged with the grey flannel mist. To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul once again. How the words rang in his ears. His soul certainly was sick to death. Too much sin. Was it true that the senses could cure it? Innocent blood had been spilt. I can think of Sybil and Basil. What could atone or make up for that? For that there was no atonement. But though forgiveness was impossible, forgetfulness was possible still, and that's why he's taking opium. And he was determined to forget, to stamp the thing out, to crush it as one would crush the adder, the snake that had stung one. Indeed, what right had Basil to have spoken to him as he had done? Who had made him a judge over others? He had said things that were dreadful, horrible, not to be endured. True, but on and on plodded the hansom, the cab, going slower. It seemed to him, at each step. He thrust up the trap and called to the man to drive faster. The hideous hunger for opium began to gnaw at him, to eat at him, so he's badly addicted. His throat burnt, and his delicate hands twitched nervously together. He struck at the horse madly with his stick. The driver laughed and whipped up. He laughed in answer, and the man was silent. The way seemed interminable, without end. and the streets like the black web of some sprawling spider. The monotony became unbearable, and as the mist thickened, he felt afraid. Then they passed by lonely brickfields. The fog was lighter there, and he could see the strange bottle-shaped ovens, with their orange fan-like tongues of fire. A dog barked as they went by, and far away in the darkness some wandering seagull screamed. The horse stumbled in a rut, then swerved aside and broke into a gallop. It's all very creepy. After some time they left the clay road and rattled again over rough paven streets. Most of the windows were dark, but now and then fantastic shadows were silhouetted against some lamp-lit blind. Of course, what's going on in those fantastic shadows just boggles the mind. He watched them curiously. They moved like monstrous marionettes and made gestures like live things. He hated them. A dull rage was in his heart. As they turned a corner, a woman yelled something at them from an open door, and two men ran after the hansom for about 100 yards. The driver beat at them with his whip. More creepy things, being chased by strangers. It is said that passion makes one think in a circle. Certainly with hideous iteration, the bitten lips of Dorian Gray shaped and reshaped those subtle words that dealt with soul and sense. He keeps saying again Lord Henry's words, cure the soul by means of the senses, till he had found in them the full expression, as it were, of his mood, and justified by intellectual approval passions that without such justification would still have dominated his temper. From cell to cell of his brain crept the one thought, and the wild desire to live. The most terrible of all man's appetites, quickened into force each trembling nerve and fibre. Ugliness that had once been hateful to him because it made things real, became dear or precious to him now for that very reason. Ugliness was the one reality. The coarse brawl, fight, the loathsome den, the dingy dive, the crude violence of disordered life, the very vileness or terribleness of thief and outcast were more vivid, were stronger, in their intense actuality of impression than all the gracious shapes of art, the dreamy shadows of song. Yes, he used to like art. Now he's seemingly finding more satisfaction in seeing the bad side of life. They were what he needed for forgetfulness. In 3 days he would be free. Is it going to take him 3 days of opium to be free of his nightmares? Suddenly the man drew up with a jerk at the top of a dark lane. Over the low roofs and jagged chimney stacks of the houses rose the black masts of ships near the docks again, dingy. Wreaths of white mist clung like ghostly sails to the yards, that simile adding to the spooky atmosphere. "Somewhere about there, sir, ain't it?" he asked huskily through the trap. Dorian started and peered round. "This'll do," he answered, and having got out hastily and given the driver the extra fare he had promised him, he walked quickly in the direction of the quay. Here and there a lantern gleamed at the stern of some huge merchantman. The light shook and splintered in the puddles. A red glare came from an outward-bound steamer that was coaling. The slimy pavement looked like a wet raincoat. He hurried on toward the left, glancing back now and then to see if he was being followed. In about 7 or 8 minutes, he reached a small, shabby house. It was wedged in between two gaunt factories. In one of the top windows stood a lamp. He stopped and gave a peculiar knock. It's a knock in code, it seems. After a little time, he heard steps in the passage and the chain being unhooked. The door opened quietly, and he went in without saying a word to the squat, misshapen figure that flattened itself into the shadow as he passed. This is a person, but described almost as a monster. At the end of the hall hung a tattered green curtain that swayed and shook in the gusty wind, which had followed him in from the street. He dragged it aside and entered a long, low room which looked as if it had once been a third-rate dancing saloon. Shrill, flaring gas jets, dulled and distorted in the fly-blown mirrors that faced them, were ranged around the walls. Greasy reflectors of ribbed tin backed them, making quivering discs of light. The floor was covered with ochre-coloured sawdust, trampled here and there into mud, and stained with dark rings of spilt liquor. These little details about the setting. Some Malays were crouching by a little charcoal stove, playing with bone counters and showing their white teeth as they chattered. In one corner, with his head buried in his arms, a sailor sprawled over a table. And by the tawdrily or cheap and ugly painted bar that ran across one complete side, stood two haggard women mocking an old man who was brushing the sleeves of his coat with an expression of disgust. "Ah, he thinks he's got red ants on him," laughed one of them as Dorian passed by. The man looked at her in terror and began to whimper. He's on some opium trip there that he thinks he's got red ants on him. At the end of the room, there was a little staircase leading to a darkened chamber. As Dorian hurried up its 3 rickety steps, the heavy odor of opium met him. He heaved a deep breath, and his nostrils quivered with pleasure. He's an addict. When he entered, a young man with smooth yellow hair, who was bending over a lamp, lighting a long, thin pipe, looked up at him and nodded in a hesitating manner. "Are you here, Adrian?" Adrian was mentioned at least, I think, only once before, muttered Dorian. Someone from the upper class who has a past with Dorian, but who's now been struck out of society, at least partly for opium addictions, but maybe for other things. There's been a shame, you'll see. Adrian Singleton, his name is. "Where else should I be?" He wouldn't speak like that. He's a gentleman. "Where else should I be?" He was a gentleman. He answered listlessly, tiredly. "None of the chaps will speak to me now." So there's been a disgrace. "I thought you'd left England." It was such a big disgrace that Dorian thought he'd left the country. Should we put Dorian in a different color? Darlington is not going to do anything. So we don't get the details of what the scandal was, but some hints. "My brother paid the bill at last. George doesn't speak to me either. I don't care," he added with a sigh. As long as one has this stuff, the opium, one doesn't want friends. I think I've had too many friends." Dorian winced, made a face like he's been hurt, and looked around at the grotesque things that lay in such fantastic postures on the ragged mattresses. And these are people, grotesque, weird, and ugly. The twisted limbs, the gaping mouths, the staring, lusterless eyes fascinated him. What ugliness, but he's fascinated by it. He knew in what strange heavens they were suffering. So that's what opium does to you. And what dull hells were teaching them the secret of some new joy. They were better off than he was because they've already had their fix. He was prisoned in thought. Memory, like a horrible malady or disease, was eating his soul away. The memory of his sins. From time to time he seemed to see the eyes of Basil Hallward looking at him, yet he felt he could not stay. The presence of Adrian Singleton troubled him. He wanted to be where no one would know who he was. He wanted to escape from himself. I'm going on to the other place, he said after a pause. On the wharf? Yes. That mad cat is sure to be there. They won't have her in this place now. Whoever that is. Dorian shrugged his shoulders. I'm sick of women who love one. Women who hate one are much more interesting. Besides, the stuff is better. Much the same. I like it better. Come and have something to drink. I must have something. I don't want anything, murmured the young man. Never mind. Adrian Singleton rose up wearily and followed Dorian to the bar. A half-caste in a ragged turban and a shabby Ulster coat grinned a hideous greeting. Whatever makes that greeting hideous? As he thrust a bottle of brandy and 2 tumblers in front of them. The women sidled up and began to chatter. Dorian turned his back on them and said something in a low voice to Adrian Singleton. A crooked smile, like a Malay crease, writhed across the face of one of the women. We're very proud tonight, she sneered. For God's sake, don't talk to me, cried Dorian, stomping his foot on the ground. What do you want? Money? Here it is. Don't ever speak to me again. 2 red sparks flashed for a moment in the women's sodden eyes, then flickered out and left them dull and glazed. She tossed her head and raked the coins off the counter with greedy fingers. Her companion watched her enviously because she's gotten money. It's no use, sighed Adrian Singleton. I don't care to go back. I think he means back into society. What does it matter? I'm quite happy here. Or does he mean to the other opium place? I think into the world. You will write to me if you want anything, won't you? Said Dorian after a pause. Perhaps. Good night then. Good night, answered the young man, passing up the steps and wiping his parched mouth with a handkerchief. I think it's the last time we see him. I guess he fits in the same category as Alan Campbell and, of course, nameless others whose lives have been wrecked, and maybe at least partly because of Dorian. Dorian walked to the door with a look of pain on his face. Does that show he still has some conscience? As he drew the curtain aside, a hideous laugh broke from the painted lips of the woman who had taken his money. There goes the devil's bargain, she hiccuped in a hoarse voice. Of course, that implies someone who sold his soul to the devil. Curse you, he answered. Don't call me that. She snapped her fingers. Prince Charming is what you like to be called, ain't it? She called after them. He doesn't know, and Dorian doesn't know, but it's the sailor here, who overhears the name Prince Charming and places it, and now we're going to work out very soon who is the sailor who reacts to this name, Prince Charming. Someone who thought that he didn't know the gentleman's name, but he knew that name, Prince Charming. I hope you worked it out already. The drowsy sailor leapt to his feet as she spoke and looked wildly around. He's looking wildly because he's heard that name, Prince Charming. The sound of the shutting of the hall door fell on his ear. He rushed out as if in pursuit, as if he's chasing them. Dorian Gray hurried along the quay through the drizzling rain. His meeting with Adrian Singleton had strangely moved him, so he does feel something. And he wondered if the ruin of that young life, Adrian's life was ruined, was really to be laid at his door, as Basil Hallward had said to him with such infamy of insult. He bit his lip, and for a few seconds his eyes grew sad. So it looks like he does feel something, but of course it's only for a few seconds. So it's not much. Yet, after all, what did it matter to him? He seems to get over it. One's days were too brief to take the burden of another's errors on one's shoulders. In other words, your thoughts. The selfish thought sounds to me like Lord Henry, this kind of thinking. Each man lived his own life and paid his own price for living it. And I guess you could apply those words to the novel as a whole. The only pity was one had to pay so often for a single fault. One had to pay over and over again indeed. In her dealings with man, destiny never closed her accounts. So this is about karma. And you could apply this to the whole novel. There are moments, psychologists tell us, when the passion for sin, or for what the world calls sin, so dominates a nature that every fiber of the body, as every cell of the brain, seems to be instinct with fearful impulses. Men and women at such moments lose the freedom of their will. They move to their terrible end as automatons or machines move. Choice is taken from them, and conscience is either killed, or if it lives at all, lives but to give rebellion its fascination and disobedience its charm. For all sins, as theologians or church people weary not of reminding us, are sins of disobedience. When that high spirit, that morning star of evil, fell from heaven, it was as a rebel that he fell. Lucifer. Callous, concentrated on evil, with stained mind, and soul hungry for rebellion, Dorian Gray hastened on, quickening his step as he went. But as he darted aside into a dim archway that had served him often as a shortcut to the ill-famed place where he was going, he felt himself suddenly seized from behind. Someone's grabbing him from behind. If you worked out who was that sailor, you'd know who this is grabbing Dorian from behind. It's James Vane, of course. And before he had time to defend himself, he was thrust back against the wall with a brutal hand around his throat. He struggled madly for life, and by a terrible effort wrenched the tightening fingers away. In a second, he heard the click of a revolver and saw the gleam of a polished barrel pointing straight at his head, a gun, and the dusky form of a short, thick-set man facing him. "What do you want?" he gasped. "Keep quiet," said the man. "If you stir, I'll shoot you if you move." "You're mad. What have I done to you?" "You wrecked the life of Sybil Vane." That's where most of us, for the first time, work out this is James, was the answer. "And Sybil Vane was my sister." So he's come back from Australia to pursue revenge. Of course, he had nothing to go on, really, but this name, Prince Charming. "She killed herself, I know it. Her death is at your door. I swore I would kill you in return. For years I've sought you." So long he searched him out. "I had no clue, no trace. The two people who could have described you were dead." I'm wondering, who are these two people? "I knew nothing of you but the pet name she used to call you, Prince Charming. I heard it tonight by chance. Make your peace with God, for tonight you are going to die." Oh, horror. Dorian Gray grew sick with fear. "I never knew her," he stammered. "I never heard of her. You're mad. You better confess your sin, for as sure as I'm James Vane, you are going to die." There was a horrible moment. Dorian did not know what to say or do. "Down on your knees," growled the man. "I'll give you 1 minute to make your peace. No more. I go on board tonight for India, and I must do my job first. 1 minute, that's all." Dorian's arms fell to his side. Paralyzed with terror, he did not know what to do. Suddenly a wild hope flashed across his brain. "Stop," he cried. "How long ago is it since your sister died? Quick, tell me." 18 years, said the man. "Why do you ask me? What do years matter?" 18 years? laughed Dorian Gray with a touch of triumph in his face. 18 years! Set me under the lamp and look at my face. James Vane hesitated for a moment, not understanding what was meant. Then he seized Dorian Gray and dragged him from the archway. Dim and wavering as was the wind-blown light, yet it served to show him the hideous error, as it seemed, into which he had fallen. For the face of the man he had sought to kill had all the bloom of boyhood. Dorian still looks like a boy, and we could say because of the devil's bargain. All the unstained purity of youth. Appearance versus reality. He looks so innocent. We know what's underneath there. He seemed little more than a lad of 20 summers, hardly older, if older indeed at all, than his sister had been when they had parted so many years ago. He still looks 20. How could he have known Sybil Vane all those years ago? It was obvious that this was not the man who had destroyed her life. He loosened his hold and reeled back. My God, he cried, and I would have murdered you. He thinks he's made a terrible mistake. This guy looks too young. Dorian Gray drew a long breath. You have been on the brink of committing a terrible crime, my man, he said, looking at him sternly. Let this be a warning to you not to take vengeance into your own hands. Forgive me, sir, muttered James Vane. I was deceived. A chance word I heard in that damned den set me on the wrong track. You'd better go home and put that pistol away, or you may get into trouble, said Dorian, turning on his heel and going slowly down the street. James Vane stood on the pavement in horror. He was trembling from head to foot. After a little while, a black shadow that had been creeping along the dripping wall moved out into the light and came close to him with stealthy footsteps. He felt a hand laid on his arm and looked round with a start. It was one of the women who'd been drinking at the bar. Why didn't you kill him? She hissed out, putting her haggard face quite close to his. I knew you were following him when you rushed out from Daly's. You fool! You should have killed him. He has lots of money, and he's as bad as bad. He's not the man I'm looking for, he answered, and I want no man's money. I want a man's life. The man whose life I want must be nearly 40 by now. This one is little more than a boy. Thank God I've not got his blood upon my hands. She tells him the truth. The woman gave a bitter laugh, because it's actually not even funny. Little more than a boy, she sneered. Why, man, it's nigh on 18 years since Prince Charming made me what I am. She knew him almost 18 years ago. God knows what he did to her. He ruined her life as well, and he still looks like a boy. You lie, cried James Vane. She raised her hand up to heaven. Before God, I'm telling the truth, she cried. Before God, strike me dumb if it ain't so. He's the worst one that comes here. They say he has sold himself to the devil for a pretty face. It's nigh on 18 years since I met him. He hasn't changed much since then. I have, though. I guess she lost her innocence and maybe all sorts of other things. Dorian. You swear this? I swear it, came in hoarse echo from her flat mouth. But don't give me away to him. Don't tell, she whined. I'm afraid of him. Let me have some money for my night's lodging. He broke from her with an oath and rushed to the corner of the street. But Dorian Gray had disappeared. When he looked back, the woman had vanished also. James Vane loses this opportunity to get his revenge on Dorian. We also saw in this chapter Dorian really sinking to the lowest of the low and getting away. But we are hurtling towards the frightening climax of this wonderful novel. Hope you're enjoying it, and hope to see you again in chapter 17.